Warm welcome from Watermark to join us on this follow-up discussion on our board diversity index. You may have seen some of our report, and you may have seen some of the press, which we'll talk you through today. And today we're trying to support boards and directors on how we could make this more practical and how we could implement some of our observations that we've seen. And I'm delighted to be joined by an expert panel today. Marina, who's the chair of the National Foundation for Australia-China Relations and a non-executive director at the Australian Institute of Company Directors, Metcash, Southern Cross Austereo, Transurban, and Adore Beauty. Welcome, Marina. Karina Kwan, who's a non-executive director of HSBC and Export Finance Australia, as well as Wilson Asset Management. Welcome, Karina. And Peter Barker, chair and non-executive director of Mastermyne Group and a non-executive director at Downer and WorkPac. Pleasure to have you here, Peter. So today we're going to start off with myself talking through some of the highlights of the Board Diversity Index and bringing to you the data that we've observed over this year and the last 11 years. Then we're going to have some questions and insights from the panel, and then we're going to have some time at the end for a Q&A. So as we go through the session, please write down your questions into the chat, and I'll do my best to answer as many as I can towards the end of the conversation. But we will have some time for that. So without further ado, we will get into it. So on behalf of myself and all the panelists, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land. We'd like to pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'm seated today on the Gadigal land of the Eora Nation. So welcome to any of our viewers out there who are from Indigenous Australia. So the Board Diversity Index, it is quite an undertaking, as you may have seen some of our report. We are the only firm, and this is the only report who is looking at diversity in 5 forms. So we view the conversation being much more than gender. We look at diversity in all its forms, or as many as we can assess at least. So we do cover gender, but we also look at cultural background, skills and experience, age, and tenure and independence. And we've been doing those for 11 years. More recently, we've got a little bit more ambitious and tried to look at some other areas of diversity. Those include the First Nations, those who are living with a disability, and LGBTQ+. They are much harder to get all the information that we need, but we're doing our best and we welcome any suggestions on how best we do that. But we'll share what we have found with you on that front. So we look at every seat on the ASX 300 and we code it by these descriptors. To give you a sense, it's over 30,000 pieces of discrete data. It's quite an undertaking that we go through, and we've done our best to summarize it in a report for you. It's about 30 or so pages. You can pull out the relevant bits that you need. It's on our website. It's also on the Australian Institute of Company Directors, and it's also on Deloitte, who are our partners in this report. So you may have seen some of the media, got on a few of the news programs. It's in the Financial Review. There's been lots of recent discussions on it. You'll have also seen in the last week, AICD have also updated their gender data on the ASX 200. So we'll talk through that in a moment. So on gender, what have we seen over the last 11 years or so? We've seen progress, significant progress, particularly on gender. So you might have seen our numbers there from 2016, where roughly 20% of board seats were taken up by men. And today it's, 20% were taken up by women. And today it's 37% taken up by women. So we've seen great progress on gender. The job is not done. There's much more to go. And if you look at the layers of how that has happened, the next wave of growth or progress is actually going to be more difficult than the first wave. And we'll talk through that today. We've seen great progress on the laggards in the group, is what I would say. This year, we only have 40 boards who have 0 or 1 women. Last year, that was 57. So the ones that are starting to get a grasp of how to move this along. And 11 boards this year who are only all male, and 13 last year. So this is a continuing trend that we don't see slowing anytime soon. Cultural background. This is probably my greatest frustration when I look and put together the data every year. This has effectively not moved in 11 years. And depending on how you look at it, it's actually gone backwards in some ways. So 91.9% of board directors are from an Anglo-Celtic background. Does that represent our society? Does that give boards the recollection to look at their customers or their trading partners in the region? And our view is not. But importantly, it doesn't represent diversity of thought at the boardroom table. And this is what we'd like to support organisations in Australia to progress. And that's why we've collated this great group of panelists today to help you on that journey. Other types of diversity, skills and independence. 82% of directors have an undergraduate degree. It's nearly table stakes now. Independence side, 17.7% are regarded as non-independent. If you remove major shareholders or significant shareholders and you remove managing directors and or CEOs who are on the board as well, then that number drops down to low single digits. So from an independence perspective, we think that's healthy. Age, you can see the average ages there. That really hasn't moved over the time we've been measuring this data. And if you think that most directors come from an executive career before going onto the board, that makes sense. However, as we change into a new digital world, is that going to be the best representation on how we can move faster on technology or some other issues? Perhaps we might see some change on the age over the years ahead. Tenure, you can see those numbers there, and more than 2/3 of directors have been on the board for less than 10 years. We feel that's a healthy number. So significantly underrepresented groups. We have looked at every board seat on the 300 and we could not find anyone who was willing to disclose they were living with a disability. Now, I do know that not to be true, but they're not willing to disclose. So regardless of that fact, however many there are, there's a lot less than the percentage of Australia's population. So perhaps there's a societal, cultural issue there with disclosure, and I can understand that. But as a society and a culture, this is a cohort we're missing out on. Similar to LGBTQ+. We've seen this increase slightly over the years with some more people disclosing their preferences. But again, it's a significantly underrepresented group. Okay, so this is over the 11 years we've been gathering the data. Women on board seats is effectively nearly doubled from 399 to 781 over those 11 years, and we see that momentum continuing. Cultural diversity piece I touched on. This is probably my biggest frustration here. And we've actually seen in the last year or so a slight increase in Anglo-Celtic directors. So not only is it not moving, in some respects it's moving in the wrong direction. We're fishing from the same pool on that front. Qualifications, you can see there. Probably the last point I'll draw your attention to is on the bottom right hand of your screen, is that governance qualifications are actually decreasing. Is that a healthy thing for our boards? I'll let you ascertain that. But roughly 37% have a governance qualification. And when we do that, we look at AICD, we look at Governance Institute, and there's university programs as well. So I've tried to summarize a 30-page report for you in about 8 minutes. There's a lot more detail to it. Please go on and have a look at it if you haven't already. So there's 2,100 seats for those of you who are curious. You can see the numbers there. 170 filled by non-Anglo-Celtic directors of the 2,100. Something we'd like to unpack a bit further. We have 7 roles filled by Indigenous directors, and they are across 5 people. So 5 people hold those 7 seats. It's an increase from last year where we had 4 directors. Okay, so hopefully you've found that useful and engaging, and a refresh perhaps of some of the data. And thank you for all your engagement and participation in the chat today. Please do keep those questions coming. So over to you, panelists. We welcome your thoughts and insights on this data and your experience and how we can help those listening in, dialing in today, how they might be able to help us. So Marina, I'm going to start with you, if you're willing. Sure. Given your experience across a range of industries, what strategies have you seen succeed at both the board and the executive level in increasing diversity in all its forms?
Thank you. I have, I guess it depends on the organisation, but there are a couple of things that many of the organisations that I'm involved with have consistently engaged in terms of ensuring greater diversity. So it starts with why. So I think that's the most important thing. So the why for every organisation will be different, but generally, as a general rule, if there is, if you look at your customer base and you look at your staff, and they don't feel represented, then I think that's a pretty good starting point. So one of the things that we do throughout the organisation, both in management, but obviously particularly in management, but also at the board level, is to collect data. And to your point, David, you said the people who are willing to be counted. It's easier when it's gender. Sometimes it's not as easy, but largely it's easier when it's gender. It's harder when it's cultural diversity, and I suspect even harder if there's a disability, particularly one that's not a visible disability. And part of the reason is that most people who will say that they don't want to provide that data are fearful. So that's why, for me, it comes back to why. So the organisations that do this really well talk to the team, talk to the organisation about why as a positive. So this is a positive reason for wanting to collect the data, because we actually want to ensure that we achieve a diverse organisation, a diverse board that meets the needs of customers and staff. And so I think that is a really important point that I think the organisations that I've been involved with do really well. And it makes data collection easier. And again, we're not mandated to collect data around other forms of diversity other than gender, but organisations that really care still collect that data. And, as I said, I'm involved in a lot of organisations that actually do collect that data. And there's at least a couple of them where the, management in particular, but, certainly the CEO is remunerated against that data. So that's quite important. That's for our organisations. The other thing that I would just add is that, particularly around the board table, there is a tendency to ensure that the person who has the diversity, they're sort of lumped with ensuring that form of diversity is met. The organisations that do this really well don't do that. So they have that person on the board, but it's not only their responsibility to look out for that diversity. Everybody owns it. And it starts with the chair. So the chair makes it very clear that even though we have Marina on the board and she has this background, this is not purely her domain. We all own it. And I see that around my board tables. It's kind of living, breathing, where other people are jumping in. And, I'm on a board where I will call out particularly, gender diversity issues. And on this particular board, I know I never have to, because there's always a couple of guys who will call it out before me, and I just feel really good about that. So I think that's the other danger. If we say, well, that, this form of diversity is left with that person, and then, so therefore the pressure's off everybody else. So I'll leave it there so that I'm sure others would like to contribute.
Yeah, thanks, Marina. And look, data is so powerful. There's nowhere to hide once you've got the data. And you raise an interesting point there on the last piece around it's not an individual's responsibility, because at the boardroom table you have strong views. Our view is you need several people to bring a strong case at the boardroom table. If it's on one person, we find that it doesn't actually move, or it's very easily shut down going, thanks for that opinion, we're going to move in this direction. And that's why we need multiple people advocating for this. And I think there's a lot we can learn. But Pedro, I'm gonna go to you next. You've had a very interesting career both internationally and domestically, and across a variety of industries. Currently, your board portfolio is what I would call more in the heavier industries, construction, infrastructure style industries. And in our experience, these can be more difficult to get improved diversity. But yet some of the boards you're on are making real progress. I'd love to learn from you what you're seeing work, what perhaps hasn't worked over the years. What's been your experience, Peter?
Yeah, thanks, David, and good morning, everybody. So look, Marina used the term the why. I'll build on that by saying that the phraseology we use at the larger board that I'm on, is the imperative. And having the imperative of a board that is representative of your stakeholders is very important for us. It's not important for every company, but it's very important for us. And so I just wanted to build on that point firstly. And I think secondly, the approach we've taken is to make slow and steady progress. So where you're starting from may not be great, but if you're heading in the right direction, then you keep chipping away that you get there eventually. And I think that's why, looking at some of the stats that you put up earlier, in terms of gender diversity, there are some great stories. I'm on the board of, as you said earlier, I'm on the board of Downer, and we are an Australian-New Zealand company. And we've also, one of our board members has strong Indigenous Maori background, and this lady is a formidable intellect, and she is a superb executive, now a superb NED, who just happens to be of Indigenous background, not the other way around. And I think that's the real success story there. By contrast, I'm also involved in a small underground mining services company where our stakeholders the stakeholder group is far smaller, far narrower. Getting diversity there, we've focused on executive diversity and bringing Indigenous kids in. And we're making progress there, but we're not at a board level. We haven't made anywhere near as much progress as we'd like. But so I think there are as Marina said, it's the why. The imperative is crucial, and making progress are the two takeaways for me. And by the way, heavy industry, those people do exist. So we now have 4 former construction heavy industry executives, female ex-executives, now NEDs, on our board, compared to the three males. So yes, indeed, it can be done.
Thanks, Peter, and that's great to see. And I'm completely with you, as are we all at Watermark Search. It's not around there not being the people. It's around how hard are we looking to find them, and how hard are we supporting them in these pathways to get access to these boards. It's important that I will clarify, when a board looks at an appointment on their board, we look at the skills matrix first. Then we look at which talent pools we're going to. This is an important distinction that some people are sort of commenting on here. This is around increasing talent pools for diverse directors to contribute to the board. And that's what we'd like to sort of unpack, and how hard are we looking in that sort of space. I want to go to you, Karina, before we have sort of an open discussion. But your board portfolio spans both regional and international contexts. Given the evolving economic climate, what is your view of how board skills need to respond? And how has your lived experience shaped and informed your perspective?
Thanks very much, David, and good morning, everyone. Look, I think most people would agree that the last, say, 3 to 5 years, economically, if I could start that way, have actually been quite tough, particularly post-COVID. And if one looks forward, if you think of just what's been happening recently in the news, particularly post-Liberation Day in April, there's a lot more volatility now. There's a lot more uncertainty. We live in what's called a VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous. And that speed of that change appears to be increasing. So, even what we're seeing now, and these are what economists are saying across the board, that there's a lot more, a lot of companies are actually holding back on investing because of this uncertainty. And as a result, there's a lot of economies globally that are actually either going backwards or going to flatline. That's what economists are saying. So one of the things is that when I look at Australia in general, I look at some of the data, And one report that came out recently, this was about 2 years ago actually, was Nicholas Moore's Southeast Asia report. And that was issued in 2023. And what he's saying is that there's a problem where Australian companies are actually investing overseas, where 60% of our foreign investment is in markets that are in US, UK, and Europe. And based on what the economists are saying, that these markets are actually going to be very challenged over the next several years, the question that I have is, what is it that boards are doing and decision makers in companies doing to actually diversify where they're investing? Now, even if you're on a board where you've got a purely domestic market, well, another stat that I've looked at is that 50% of Australia's population is either born overseas or their parents were. So they are actually very culturally diverse. Are our boards actually looking at different markets, looking at, are our boards representative of the people whom we serve, whether it's overseas markets that we're looking at, as well as locally? So that's a question that I would ask, when I'm looking at the skills matrix. I'll just give you some stats from Nicholas Moore's report, because it's quite helpful. And although this is a report about Southeast Asia, I'm not actually saying, one's got to invest in Southeast Asia. I'm just quoting this report because it's actually a report that's recent and it's got stats in it. So Southeast Asia is the fastest growing region in the world. In 2022, Southeast Asia's economy as a bloc is 2 times Australia's GDP. By 2040, Southeast Asia is predicted to be the 4th biggest economy globally after the US, China, and India. And by 2040, Southeast Asia's consumer market is predicted to be 10 times Australia's. But only 3% of Australia's outward foreign investment is in Southeast Asia, whereas it's 60% in US, UK, and Europe. So this is one of the challenges that the economists are saying to us, that those particular markets, which are traditional markets, we are going to have to find new markets if you want to grow and if you want to be economically prosperous for us as a economy and also for your company. So I just lay that as being an economic backdrop as to why I think we need to be reviewing what we're doing at board level. The question that Nicholas Moore actually put in his report is, why aren't we diversifying into new markets? And one of the reasons he says is that there's a lack of decision makers, as in executives and boards, in terms of cultural literacy. In other words, understanding the customs and practices and language and regulation of new markets, and also of their domestic customer base. So the question is, how do you fix this cultural awareness issue? You really have to look at those decision makers. And for me, that includes the C-suite as well as the board, because as we all know, people at executive level, they make the executive decisions. The board makes strategic decisions. So both have to be aligned. So when we look at the data that Watermark put out, it's a bit of an eye-opener that only 8%, in terms of those 2025 stats, of ASX 300 directors are culturally diverse. So for me, I actually think that's quite pathetic, right? Based on the stats that I've just given you about Nicholas's report, and also about our domestic population. So I think we need to appoint culturally diverse executives to feed the director pipeline, as well as appointing board directors who are much more culturally diverse. Now, the one thing I'd like to make really clear is I'm not necessarily saying that one has to appoint directors and C-suite people who look brown or yellow, people like me. I'm talking about appointing people who've got a culturally diverse mindset, which means it includes everybody. And I also want to point out that I've come across many Anglo-Saxon colleagues who've actually spent many years overseas, people like Peter, for instance, and yet They build up so much great knowledge, bring it back into Australia, and yet that experience is not appreciated. So there's something about the mindset of the way in which we recruit at executive level, potentially at board level, that we need to review. I'll just give some personal insights about me. Look, I grew up in Papua New Guinea. I'm Chinese, grew up in a Chinese family in a multicultural society, and I was looked after by a Papuan nanny. I was speaking 3 languages. I actually went to university here in Sydney, and I've worked and lived here since. So I would say I know how to bridge Australian, Chinese, and South Pacific cultures. I'd say from the time that I could read and write, my parents automatically had me as being an interpreter, a facilitator, connector, research analyst, whatever my parents wanted to run past me. My parents ran their own business, and they actually gave me business contracts to read from the time I was 12. So that meant I got very familiar with the Collins Dictionary. But if you roll forward to working here, when I talk about my executive career, I spent many years working at Citi here in Australia in an international bank, and I worked with people effectively from the United Nations, accents from everywhere. And one of the things I found is that when you're immersed as part of that sort of culture, you actually learn a lot about how to read people and how to understand the intuitive things and body language that you wouldn't otherwise. For instance, I'll give you an example. If talking to an Indian colleague who responds like this, bobbing their head from left to right, how would you interpret that? And an Australian colleague who I worked with, who had grown up in a monoculture, actually thought in that particular meeting our Indian colleague was disagreeing, and I said no, he actually agrees. And then there's another example where when talking, this is in a commercial meeting, we were talking to a Chinese client who was actually listening intently and whose head was nodding. During the break, my Australian colleague said, well, I think they agree with us. And I asked, well, what makes you think that? They said, because they're nodding and they're not objecting to anything that we said. And I said, actually, no, they're being respectful. They're waiting to be invited to speak. So we went back into the meeting after the break, and we asked the question what they thought. And we received such profound insights from their comments that enabled us to address these. And then, we eventually closed the deal. So I'll give you these couple of examples in that if you don't have people on your boards and on your C-suite that have a culturally diverse mindset, you will literally make the wrong decisions and you'll miss out on opportunities, and you just don't know. You just won't know that you have. So if I roll forward to my boards at the moment, I tend to pick boards now which, although I'm based in Australia, that these are boards which have an outwards outlook. And I find that because of my background and my executive experience, I find I ask different questions and I see different connection opportunities to what my colleagues can see. For instance, on HSBC, and I also do some work at Sydney Uni, I've been able to connect the two organisations by identifying and brokering MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding, which is now providing commercial opportunities for both. Then at a more basic level, if there's a customer communication that's due to go out, I might be asking the comms team, are you intending to send it out in Chinese as well as English, considering the diversity of our customer base? And sometimes they haven't thought of that. So the fact that I'm reminding them is actually a good trigger. Then on Export Finance Australia, which is a federal government agency that assists organisations to access export markets, and it works with DFAT, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. This is where diplomacy and commercial outcomes converge. And so I also ask the management, how are they representing the organisation at international forums which is potentially not a question that other directors may ask. And I was very pleased to hear that the management really draw on the diverse cultural heritage of its employees to open doors and deepen engagement. And even to this day, that those engagements are still very strong as a result of that. So I'm just giving you some of those examples of which, if you've got somebody who's actually asking questions in a different way, you will actually be able to present opportunities to the organisation that they might not otherwise see. I also think about, well, what happens if we don't increase a cultural diverse mindset on our boards. Well, first of all, I think the next 5 to 10 years will be tough economically. But if you don't look at diversifying into different markets and into really thinking about how you tap into your domestic customer base, you might actually experience the Kodak moment. In other words, you don't know what you missed. And by the time you wake up in 5 to 10 years' time and that your competition has overrun you, you will actually ask, well, what is it that we didn't know? And potentially we're too inwardly looking that we actually didn't ask the question. So that's something I'd just like to put out there. One action I would really like to see, though, is I'd like to see cultural diversity gain momentum on boards through a general sponsorship program. Because one of the things that I do see is that gender diversity has really moved as a result of various programs that have come up. What I'd love to see is organisations like Watermark and AICD sponsor a program that promotes cultural diversity on boards as well as C-suite, similar to the AICD's Chairs Mentoring Program, which has done a lot for promoting gender diversity. So that's something I thought I'd leave with you, David.
Thank you, Karina, and thank you for the insights and the personal experience and some of the practical tips and the benefits of having a diverse viewpoint on some of these boards. And it can be sometimes asking a really good question and identifying a blind spot. It's not conscious for some of these people, it's unconscious. And that's the piece that I'm most interested in unlocking. And I accept your challenge around a mentorship program. Watch this space. We'll be coming with an update with you soon. So we look forward to sharing that with you. I want to ask both Peter and Marina, what are some of the invisible barriers that you're seeing, and or how do we overcome them? And I'll just share one to get you thinking. In that, when we produce a shortlist for board appointments, we are constantly highlighting diverse candidates in any or all of its forms. And in many occasions, when we get down to the final stage, chairs or heads of nom and rem committees go with the person that's done it 2 or 3 times before, or has the ASX listed experience, for example. And this is a constant barrier we're coming up against. And our view is, well, what are you actually missing out on? You have 7 other directors around the table with ASX experience, for example. Isn't this an advantage to be something different or have a different perspective of? But I'd really welcome your thoughts. Perhaps, Marina, I'll go to you first. And what do you think some of the invisible barriers are, and how do we overcome them? And then we'll follow with you, Peter.
Thank you, David. This is a bit of a pet interest of mine. I think there is definitely, I don't know if it's unconscious bias, but there's certainly invisible barrier around this thing called style and fit, and it annoys the hell out of me. So the whole style thing, do they have the right style to be a director? And of course, people that come from different backgrounds have a completely different style. And without stereotyping, but certainly I've observed it on many boards. Often people who come from an Asian background will be a lot quieter, right? And they might wait to be spoken to, as opposed to kind of jumping in. And that's seen as not the right style for the board. That's not the right style for a director. So it's getting people to understand that, actually, if you adjust your thoughts around really what style looks like these days. And I think the whole concept of what leadership looks like is changing. So it used to be the table thumping guy who was, running the place, and now it's more distributed leadership. Hopefully, in most places, it certainly is where I am. And so style is changing, but I think the assumptions around a lot of board tables is that actually leaders look like the old style of leaders. And so one of the things that having someone on the board, and then obviously someone in the nominations committee who understands, to Karina's point, the diversity mindset, you're going to be looking for different styles, because style is a form of diversity as well. So I think that's one of the problems. People are looking for a certain style. And that then comes to fit. Will they fit in with us? Are they like us? One of my early observations when I first became a director was, in my past, I chaired a rugby league club. And that actually was almost the entry point for me in getting into boards, because the people that were interviewing me, I was a great fit because we could talk about sport. Nothing to do with the boards. We could talk about sport. And this is a barrier if you come from a background where you can't talk about those things. So I think we really need to be forcing ourselves to have a look at our own biases and what we really believe we want. So if we say we want diversity, let's have a think about what that means and what does that look like actually around the board table, because style and fit, and sometimes it's good to have somebody who doesn't necessarily fit because they shake things up a little bit, and you're less likely to have groupthink. But it takes a brave. For me, it comes to the chair. I think it comes down to the chair, and it takes, well, I was going to say a brave and courageous chair. Actually, it's braver to choose somebody who is different than it is to not choose somebody who is different. I think we should give credit to those chairs who take a punt. But also there's great cases of examples of people who've joined a board for the first time, they've been very different and it's worked out. And I think we should share those cases, because that gives the less courageous chairs and boards more courage.
Peter.
Yeah, for the second time on this call, I'm going to come in behind Marina and support what she just said. It's interesting. A culture will exist in an organisation, whether it's intended or not. And so the power of the leader of an organisation to help set the standards, set the expectations, is absolutely crucial. And if there's a void there, then the culture will develop, but it may not be what's in the best interest of the organisation, but it absolutely will develop. I think the power of the chair to recognise the different styles and personalities around the board table. And it's not just the chair of the board, it's the chair of the Audit and Risk Committee, it's the chair of People and Communities, chair of Zero Harm, etc. But to really recognise and draw out the experience of people around the board table is a superpower, and you can really see it well when it's working. And also the ability to tell the shouty person on the board, okay, thank you, I've heard your view. I'd like to now, and specifically ensure that all views get on the table, however that's done, and that's a real superpower. There's also, of course, the challenge of supply and demand. So, and I think we've talked about that, and Karina talked to the importance of mindset, etc. So that will improve over time, but that's that gradual improvement point I was making earlier.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks you to you both. That's great. To the audience out there, we're coming up to the Q&A session. Loving your comments in there. Thank you so much. If you do have questions for your panelists, please pop them in the chat, and I will do my best to get through as many as I can. I've seen some of those ones in there that I can answer. After we do the Q&A, we're going to do a top tip from our panelists. So stay tuned as we see how we can actually implement some of these successes that they're seeing. But one final question for all three of you before we go to the Q&A. Can you share a moment when cultural diversity, either present or absent, impacted the quality of a board decision making and governance outcomes? Karina, I'm going to start with you, then Marina, and then Peter, and then I'm going to go to the Q&A.
David, I would, an example I have of that is, yes, I've been on a board where the presumption was that we're all going to go down this particular path because we all think the same. And as a result, the organisation went into halfway down this strategic path and suddenly discovered, oh, we've actually missed out on incorporating a diversity of mindset regarding our stakeholder base. And it was a big aha moment, and it actually cost the organisation quite a bit of money to pivot. That only happened, that aha moment only happened because someone on the board said, well, what about this? It was actually a new person that came on the board. And then there was an executive that said, oh, yes. And that executive actually was a lonely voice. And it's only because somebody else on the board raised it and then created open space for that conversation to be held that the action item that subsequently came back from the board opened up a whole new perspective that hadn't been received before. So this is something which, if as a chair, as a committee chair, if you're not ensuring that we're getting all the voices around the table to be heard, and to Marina and Peter's point, if you've got people who've got personalities that seem relatively quiet, one has to ask, what's your opinion? Because when you invite, you will be surprised that people are just waiting for a trigger to say something, but the topic may not have moved in that direction. But if they're actually invited to speak openly, you'll be surprised what you get. So this is something that it happened by accident, but thank God it happened before we were done. It cost money, but it wasn't the end of the earth.
And David, I'm going to give you an example where money was saved. So I was smiling when Karina was speaking because I felt like it was a very similar example. But one of the boards that I was on previously, there was an issue with a particularly large customer base that was from a specific culture and diverse background. And the management team, who were largely Caucasian and hadn't worked in those places either, had put together, a set of assumptions around what they thought we needed to do in order to kind of fix this problem. And as I said, it was a customer problem. And thankfully, there were a couple of us around the board table that started asking questions around the assumptions to do with this particular, the assumptions around what those customers would respond to and why they were unresponsive, and how that related to the size of this investment and the strategy. And it was the two of us who came from culturally diverse backgrounds who were asking the questions. We weren't necessarily from that background of that culture, but we understood, it comes back to what Karina was saying earlier about cultural diversity mindset. We understood that the assumptions were too narrow based on a specific type of customer. And as a result of probably a larger discussion than management thought they might have on this, we were able to broaden their thinking, and they went away and they came back and they had a different response to it, which saved us money, was much more effective, and we delivered an outcome that we needed. And so for me, that comes down to the quality of the discussion, which is probably what we've all been saying today, that if you have a broader set of views around the table that come from different life experiences, then you're going to have a better quality discussion, and so therefore you're going to get a better result. I mean, that's just what happens. So I've seen it in action. I've seen it in action more than once, and it's why I'm really committed to diversity around board tables.
Yeah, mine goes back to one of my executive roles, where we had the company I was CFO of. We had a significant challenge that potentially involved disclosure to the US Department of Justice, etc. And it was fortunately worked out, but it looked like it may not for a long time. And having the diversity, the international mindset that Karina referred to earlier around the board table enabled calm heads to prevail about an issue that if you didn't have an international perspective, you may well find really quite frightening and tend to over-egg the response. Instead, the response was targeted, it was appropriate, and it led to what was not material dollars-wise, but certainly potentially material reputationally-wise, not being an issue and being dealt with appropriately and professionally versus, oh my goodness, which if you didn't have that international perspective, would have been a real risk.
Okay, thank you. All right, I've got a couple of questions here from the Q&A now. Before we wrap up, we're going to have the top tip of something that we can all do today to further this cause on diversity. I've got a couple of questions here from the stats, and then we're getting a bit of a theme here that the audience would like to ask you panelists is, what is your advice on how do you break through those selection biases as we go through the process? And perhaps I could add some color to that. So whilst you ponder that, I'm going to respond to a couple of comments here. Siobhan asked around, are we seeing a change in skills on boards? Yes, we are. They're still predominantly, 38% are roughly from a finance background. Then we have some lawyers, but the STEM subjects are greatly increasing, as is technology. We're seeing some HR, albeit from a low base, but the skills is certainly broadening. In terms of the percentage of women, there's a stat here that I'll share. 18% of women directors hold 45% of the seats. So 1 in 5 women hold nearly half the seats on boards. The equivalent stat for men is 10% of men hold 20% of the seats. So there is a distinct difference. And this is my point around talent pools, and the next layer of progress on that is going to be more difficult. And we need to do more work at the executive level and the sponsorship level. And if you look at our report in partnership with Deloitte and the AICD, we have put in some 5 tips there around we can help people progress through those ranks. But Peter, I'm going to start with you to change things up. Do you have any tips for the audience on how candidates or aspiring board directors who might have 1 or 2 boards who are looking to get on the ASX, how could they break through some of those biases? Do you have any suggestions?
Look, I think certainly the understanding the culture of the board, or being a bit more targeted, I should say, David, in terms of stating, talking to people like Watermark and indeed your competitors in terms of your contacts there, and explaining what you're looking for and why has certainly, in my experience, is helpful. And strangely enough, from my own personal perspective, being one of the majority, I've personally come up in situations where I have to be ruled out because the board is looking for, in the first instance, the board is looking for a more diverse candidate, which is great, but boo-hoo me. And I think the point there, as any candidate, being quite look for the opportunities where, yeah, that would be a good fit. There is clearly a need there, and if you will, telling people, this is an organisation that I would potentially be interested in, and why, I think would be being a little clearer on that is likely to be helpful.
Thanks. Marina, Karina, any suggestions?
You go.
I'm happy to go first. Look, when you're a new director starting out, you probably feel as though you'd be willing to jump on any board. But my suggestion is you've got to find you're choosing the board just as much as they might choose you. So you've got to find a board that actually fits with you. After having had a few years' experience now, I choose to go on boards which have a similar outlook or mindset to me. In other words, I like to be on a board that may be based in Australia, but is actually playing in the international sphere, or is actually working with a really diverse customer set. That is something that I'm just putting out there as something you might want to think about. You've got to find one that's right for you. But secondly, it's also what's your unique value proposition. So I identified, because of my background and because of my executive experience, that being Chinese, being woman, also having a financial background, that the convergence of all those three things, when I mean financial background, not just working in financial services, but having been an ex-treasurer of a bank for several years, that was a unique combination. And what is it that I like to do when I'm on boards? I like to help with that international experience, helping boards to think about things that they may not have thought about. So it's how you position yourself. Having a unique value proposition is important because that distinguishes you from other candidates, but also be selective about what boards you choose to be on, because it is not that easy to get off a board if you get onto the wrong one.
The only thing I'll add is that I came from a sector that nobody knew me. So when I wanted to be a director, nobody knew who I was. So I built up experience in the not-for-profit and sports space, and that at least meant that when I went for my first ASX role, there was some experience in terms of governance that I could point to. I remember I also went around and met a lot of, tried to meet a lot of directors and, reached out to people for coffees, and I did all of that. So I did a lot of legwork, and I met with all the recruiters and made sure everybody knew who I was, because nobody knew who I was. I had absolutely no networks. But I remember having a coffee with a senior male ASX chairman who said to me, don't take a board that's less than an ASX 50. And I said to him, who's offering me an ASX 50? No one's offering me anything. No one's even offering me an ASX outside 300. So I did take whatever was offered me. I know Karina said, don't do it, but I did, because I needed the experience. And I felt that, I had to take the first board. And I have had experience where, it hasn't been the right opportunity, and I have stepped off. So I think that you have to get experience somehow. It is part of the skill set that you need. Doing the AICD course is great, but actually having some real governance experience, even with a small not-for-profit or a sporting organisation or whatever, is still beneficial. So I would recommend that directors do that. But the big leap is the networking thing. So the people who have networks, who've come from banking backgrounds, professional services, they all know each other, and it is easier. Or if they've been executives in ASX 100 companies, they're the ones that are stepping onto large boards. And so, those of us who don't come from those backgrounds have to do things differently. Unfortunately, at the moment, it's just part of it. It's what we have to do. And the only thing that I wanted to add, David, which is slightly unrelated, but to your comment around the percentage of women with board seats as opposed to the percentage of men, as that's an average, that all that says is there are many more men with board seats than there are women. So That's what it says. So, if we get to a point where we have as many men as women, there'll be fewer women that have most of the seats.
Yes. Thank you for clarifying, Marina. I think it's an important statistic as we look to grow other areas of diversity on boards. We may follow a similar path. That's one thing we will observe. I think just for my observation on that question around getting onto more boards or breaking into the ASX, I think anyone looking to do that, you must really look at the skills matrix and going, where are the opportunities to contribute to this board from a skill level? Because without that, it's sort of a non-starter. And I think that's where you need to start. And then the additional piece that you add is your diversity of thought, your diversity of experience. Perhaps it's living overseas, perhaps it's one of the other areas of diversity in all its forms. That is your X factor. And I think that if you can get in front of the right chair or nom-and-rem committee, that is really where you can make some headway on those sort of things. I had a question on the chat here around, board roles need to be advertised more broadly. The reality is most board roles are not advertised. To Marina's point, you've got to get in front of the right people. And as much as I'd like Watermark to do all the board roles, we don't. There are other firms as well you need to connect with, but please do connect with us. And so I think that is really an important part. And then you'll see in some of our reports some other tactics around there, around sponsorship and so forth. But before we go, we have 3 minutes. I want to ask all of you your top tip of what we can do today to progress diversity in all its forms. Karina, I'm going to start with you, and then Peter, and we're going to finish with Marina.
David, what I suggest is in your organisation, set up a program where you can have C-suite or senior executive people be on your boards, either as an observer or as a director, but as a non-voting member. They will bring in operational experience into the boardroom, which is very helpful in certain situations, and also will learn governance experience from others on the board. It helps develop their career, and it's a win-win.
Peter.
David, I think for the people that are on this webinar who are aspiring to be on a board, and especially those who have a form of whatever form of diverse background, working with the recruitment process, whatever that process is, to actually understand the skills matrix, as you said, David, but going a step further in terms of understanding more about the process and where you as a potential candidate sit in that, and your super strengths and your flanks through the process will serve you well. And so what that means is when you get to meet, you go through a recruitment process and there's a long list and a short list and so on. Should you find yourself sitting in front of your potential new board, you'll be one of 3, 4, 5, whatever. But physically being able to have a discussion with them that enables you to bring out your international mindset, to paraphrase Karina, to bring out your experience set, etc., that shows that, yeah, sure, you may not be the perfect fit, but you've really thought about your flanks and how you can address them in other ways. So my 3 board roles, 2 listed, 1 large private, 2 of those 3 actually came through not actually Watermark, but 2 of Watermark's competitors. And the interesting thing about that was that by speaking with the equivalent of David, and really understanding what the chair was really looking for and what their concerns were, and then saying, well, how do they relate to me? Enabled me to have a frank discussion about how I'd thought about your strengths and your flanks.
Love it, Peter. Thank you. Marina.
Yes. So in the 30 seconds we have, because I know that people have to go, I'll just quickly say, get a sponsor. If you are interested in a board role, find somebody who is going to champion you. I've had a sponsor for at least one. Now I've got a couple, but I had one in the beginning that I actively sought, and that person talks me up, recommends me to people. Most of my board roles have not come through recruiters. They've come directly because I've found the recruitment process to be part of what we're talking about right now, which is not necessarily looking for a new candidate. And so I would say try and find somebody who has more experience, who's already on a board, who can help you, first of all, understand your value, because that's part of what, David, you did a really good job of outlining, people's value, but I think everyone has to understand that themselves. And then having that person share those values and introduce you to people. That's my tip.
Thank you, Marina, Karina, and Peter. I found your insights really useful. We love your passion on this topic. I want to thank everyone out there for dialing in today. I hope you found it useful and something that you can empower yourself or your board, or a process that you're in on how we can increase diversity in all its forms. A big thank you from Watermark Search International. We look forward to connecting with you all. Enjoy the rest of your day.